Hi, sorry, I'm late. There were just too many papers to read and I got kind of stuck, but I'm unstuck now. Everything we know about what causes type 1 diabetes, part 2. Last video was about cow milk and breastfeeding and type 1 diabetes. If you haven't seen it, what are you doing here? And if you have, love you. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease with part genetic predisposition and part environmental triggers. And one of those triggers is viral infections. Yeah, and the science is solid. The first association I found between a virus and type 1 diabetes was suspected in 1947. To put things in perspective, this is the song that was top charts that year. Your grandparents were children, and the Second World War had ended just 2 years prior. At the time, this paper just noted that 2 young type 1 diabetics had the mumps a few weeks before the onset of the symptoms, but nothing more. In the following years, that idea started to get some traction. I haven't put every paper here because it's just too much, but it got more interest in the 80s. The mumps virus is not the main bad guy, nor is it Epstein-Barr virus, or CMV, or human herpes virus 6, or influenza, or pericoviruses. They do increase the risk a little bit, but not to the extent of the one we're going to talk about. You might want to avoid rubella when you're pregnant, though. These are just small fry compared to the real bad guy, which is one of the tiniest viruses we know in the enterovirus genus. Thanks, Aurora. That helps a lot. I don't know what these are. Sorry. They cause most stomach bugs, and they're called enteroviruses because they infect your intestine. The scariest thing is that these viruses are super common and we don't have vaccines yet. So there's not much we can do to avoid them, except from regular hand washing. Now, which one is it between enterovirus, poliovirus, Coxsackie virus, ecovirus, and rhinovirus? Well, you can do many things to answer that if you're working with mice, like, infect them and see what happens. And we have done that extensively, but we're not doing that with human kids. It did kind of happen during COVID, though. So now we have a lot of data on COVID and type 1 diabetes. The only 2 things you can do in humans to answer that question is vaccinate kids so they don't get infected and see if they develop type 1 diabetes anyways. But there's no freaking vaccine, so it's not polio because there's vaccine for that. Or look at what infections they got before or during the detection of autoantibodies, so a reasonable temporal link. All right, let's spoil it. It's Coxsackie viruses. More specifically, Coxsackie virus B1 and Coxsackie virus B4. First time you hear about them? It's all right. All you need to know is that they're usually not dangerous, except for newborns and people with compromised immune system. Symptoms look a lot like the flu, so fever, headache, sore throat, muscle pain, fatigue, diarrhea, but can also lead to more serious stuff like meningitis or heart damage. So yeah, fun. Let me tell you the 2 steps where they can make you say bye-bye to your insulin. The first step is the appearance of autoantibodies against beta cells and insulin. The second step is the destruction of the beta cells, and these steps can be disconnected in time. You can get antibodies against the beta cells and still retain beta cell function until something else comes and triggers progression and destruction of the beta cells. So when do they come in? Since we couldn't experiment on kids, good, people were like, okay, mumps is associated with type 1 diabetes, so maybe other viruses are too, Let's see if there's a virus out there that is often found before either this first step or this second step. Enteroviruses were already on the radar since the early 2000s, and in 2005, they were found to be associated with autoantibodies in children. But apart from a few isolated case studies, some mouse studies, and people looking at what viruses were there at type 1 diabetes diagnosis, there was no real-world data showing causality in humans. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depends how you look at it, this small study did find a temporal link. They found that enterovirus detection during the 6-month period before the first detection of autoantibodies was a strong predictor for progression to clinical type 1 diabetes. And weirdly, it's stronger in boys than girls, probably because of gender-specific immune differences. Look up man flu. This looks like viruses are implicated in the first step, the autoantibodies. This was confirming these studies from Cuba that found an association between epidemics of ecovirus and autoantibodies after people got better. So what did people do to confirm that on more people? They looked at poop, which is a great non-invasive way to look for enteroviruses. And they found that getting infected a few times and getting rid of the virus quickly didn't increase the risk of type 1 diabetes. But prolonged infection with the same virus mostly Coxsackie virus B4, increased the risk by roughly 20% for each positive poop sample. And 2 years later, two meta-analyses found that enteroviral infections were associated with around 7 times more type 1 diabetes incidence. In reality, it's between 3 and 12 times because it's just statistics. On top of these temporal links and virus in the poop and whatnot, we have found virus inside the pancreas of 70% of type 1 diabetics versus 40% for healthy people. It's in there and it's alive. But look, it's not like the pancreas is overrun with virus. No. Less than 30% of the islets, the little groups of cells that produce the insulin, are infected. What does that mean? That enteroviruses are probably creating a low but chronic, persistent infection in the pancreas. All right, cool. Coxsackie virus B can infect the pancreas and cause type 1 diabetes. But why the pancreas, though? They can infect the intestine, all right, and the pancreas is right there. There's a tube from the pancreas to the small intestine because the pancreas produces stuff for the intestine. If I was a virus, I would totally go there too. But why the beta cells, though? Turns out Coxsackie virus B needs a specific receptor, like a door, on the cells to be able to enter. And the beta cells have a lot of them, especially when they're sending stuff out through secretion, like insulin. And even more so during growth spurs, when the body is growing rapidly and needs a lot of insulin. And that explains why rapid growth has also been associated with type 1 diabetes. But why can they start type 1 diabetes? Several things can happen at the same time. The first thing is just plain cancellation of the beta cells. Virus can make the beta cells explode. That's when the immune system is not able to completely control the infection. The cells are just completely overrun and bye-bye. Second, the immune response is strong and does its thing, which is clear the infected cells, and they kill the infected beta cells. Third way, the beta cells just can't keep up. They're baseline overworked already because they need to get that insulin out. They're producing a ton of it, and their protein synthesis machines are already under stress. So when a virus comes in and is like, hey, you work for me now, and makes them produce a shit ton of virus, the beta cells just give up. What do you want them to do? Another thing that can happen is beta cell memory loss. They literally forget they're supposed to be pumping insulin out when they detect viruses. Complete loss of identity. The last but most harmful thing that happens is autoimmunity, so a destruction of healthy beta cells that didn't do anything wrong. When the cells are infected with the virus, they sense it. They have little detection thingies inside them, and they just know. When that happens, they start producing pro-inflammatory proteins. And that is usually a good thing. You get inflammation, the local cells get infection resistant, the cavalry gets in, and the infection gets cleared. But not always. Sometimes one of the detection thingies, the sensor called MDA5 inside the beta cell, works a little too well and throws off the whole immune response. It gets crazy in there, complete overreaction, and ends up being a fertile ground for autoimmunity because of the sustained local inflammation. When the infected beta cells get eaten up by the cleaning crew, something really bad happens. The cleaning crew are special cells that sort through the garbage they just ate and present bits and pieces at their surface for the other immune cells to know what's going on, kind of like a wanted poster. Now, normally the wanted posters that show a normal bystander thing will be dismissed, right? Wrong. Not in type 1 diabetes or any other autoimmune disease, because on top of an overreactive sensor, you have a looser control over autoimmunity. When the infected beta cells are the immune system can't tell the difference between viral stuff and beta cell stuff and starts looking at normal proteins like they're sus. When that happens, all the cells in the body that have these proteins at their surface will be wrongfully convicted and sentenced to a swift deletion. This whole confusion thing happens when the viral infection is not cleared fast and when there's an inflammation there for a long time, which can also be caused by a mutation in the virus. And let me tell you, these viruses mutate a lot. Like a lot. Sometimes when Coxsackie virus B loses a little part of its genome, that reduces the speed at which it replicates, and it allows it to camp in the cells and just never leave. And again, fertile ground for autoimmunity. In that case, the cell survives, but it's still spreading virus because instead of getting absolutely wrecked, it's surviving and sending packets of baby viruses around in little bags or inside little arms. The last reason beta cells get unlucky is epitope mimicry. Basically, there are proteins on the beta cells that look a lot like viral proteins or other foreign proteins, and they get caught in the crossfire because the antibodies that catch the intruders also catch them. And the immune system in predisposed people is not great at being nice to its own body. Yeah. To link this with the cow milk protein video, the inflammation in the pancreas caused by viral infection causes the beta cells to express a protein at their surface that is the one that gets the beta cells caught in the crossfire against BSA in cow milk because of epitope mimicry. Well, anyway, it's still difficult to prove direct causality because you can't infect babies on purpose and see if they develop type 1 diabetes. So temporal correlations are all we really have. Until we can vaccinate the babies and see if preventing viral infections also prevents type 1 diabetes. Children that later develop type 1 diabetes get their first autoantibodies during the first 2 years of life. So it is absolutely crucial to protect them from the triggers during the first 2 years. In fact, this study found that going to a daycare before the age of 3 increased the chances of type 1 diabetes, probably because of viral infections. And one of the reasons why breastfeeding is protective is probably because if the mother has encountered Coxsackie virus B or the other viruses here, she has antibodies against them that pass through her milk to her baby and protect it during the first critical months. You may think, great, so does that mean that in countries where exposure to enteroviruses is low, there's less type 1 diabetes? No. No, it does not. Quite the opposite, actually. And that may be similar to what happened with polio during the last century. When people stopped drinking contaminated water and when a vaccine was put on the market, overall polio cases decreased, but the people who got sick got sicker. Same with enteroviruses. The lower the exposure of the population to Coxsackie virus B, the lower the number of people with immunity, the fewer the mothers who have antibodies against it in their milk, the lower the protection it can give to babies, and the higher the impact of an infection. That's the hygiene hypothesis. I'm not quite sure about this one, but who knows? So what now? What can we do? The best thing is vaccination. So people are like, all right, let's try and vaccinate some type 1 diabetes susceptible mice and see what happens. And that's what they did in mice and monkeys. And it actually works really well. The animals didn't develop type 1 diabetes and they were protected when they tried infecting them with Coxsackie virus B, which is very cool. But if you followed what I said before, you realize that we would need to vaccinate babies super early before they get a chance of getting exposed to enteroviruses, like at 2 months old, and probably vaccinate mothers and encourage them to breastfeed if they can to offer passive protection to the babies until they can get vaccinated. So a potential vaccine has to be extremely safe because babies. In February of 2024, we got the first results for safety for a human vaccine against Coxsackie virus B, which begs the question, is this the beginning of the end of type 1 diabetes? Well, probably not, because Coxsackie virus B is not the only virus that has been linked with type 1 diabetes. There are a few more, although they have a smaller effect. For example, this very common virus that most of the kids get, and that is the major cause of diarrhea in kids, rotavirus, linked with type 1 diabetes. And then COVID. You remember COVID, right? Well, it doesn't look like it increases the incidence of type 1 diabetes, even though some say it may. But it looks like the kids who got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes during the pandemic had higher glycemia and more ketoacidosis than before at diagnosis. That could very well be due to the lockdown and changes in care, but infection with COVID or vaccination against it did temporarily mess up glucose control. So we still don't really know for sure, but probably stress on the beta cells. And as if it's not confusing enough, there are strains of Coxsackie virus B that are protective, B3 and B6. And varicella, the virus for chickenpox, is protective too. Stay tuned because I will follow up with the trials as they come out. We'll also explore the other factors of type 1 diabetes like prenatal nutrition, stress, parasites, vitamin D, genetics. And if you want to know more about the role of milk in type 1 diabetes, check this out. I think I need a shower. Have I become like more shiny throughout the video? I'll have to check. Because I am sweating profusely. Alright, thanks for watching, bye!